We now on the discussion side, after what was the interesting discussion on commodities and on policy. You've heard Tracy, you've heard Freddie. Now we have an opportunity to actually interact with some of the esteemed panelists. Next to me, we have, as he was introduced, our DG, Ramasodi, and Johan Kutse. Many people online and in the room probably know him, he's CEO from SAPO, the Pork Producers Association. Next to Johan is the chair of the Land Bank, Ms. Tabingosi, and of course our very own at BFAP, Gerard, who does amazing work on the livestock space. So to all of the colleagues that are online, if you could please send your questions through. We have a system where we'll be able to bring those into the discussion that we are having here on stage. Now, DG, having listened to all of what Freddie had painted out and what Tracy had painted out, I think I want to pick on from the slide which showed that we have prospects and possibilities of going up. But of course, if we're not changing anything, we could remain on a somewhat slow down direction. And as we look into South Africa, and I think many people also that are online will agree with the fact that we face numerous challenges. We have challenges on the inefficiencies and regulation, Act 36 and many things that people talk about. We have challenges on infrastructure, which is cross-cutting and outside your department. And I want to start from you to say, how do you frame that and what's your thinking from the department to say, working with all of the stakeholders and leading into that red line that Freddie was putting in place, because that's where we see jobs and good prospects.
No, thank you very much, Augustlo. And let me also welcome the presentations that we took this afternoon and the opportunities that they actually outline for the South African agricultural sector. And maybe where we need to start off is the good work that we have been doing with BFAP, and maybe part of the solutions that we have for the red line achievement that you are talking about lies in the agriculture and agro-processing master plan, where there is a clear determination on 6 critical issues that we need to deal with, dealing with the issues around policy ambiguity that we are having, and that would relate to the issues that we have just indicated around Act 36, as you say, dealing with the ports efficiencies, maybe not only port efficiencies, but effectiveness and also port resilience, because in terms of the discussions that we have had this afternoon was what happens after the disruptions that we have at the ports. We also need to create an enabling infrastructure, both on and off farm, in terms of us achieving the dizzy heights that have been painted for today. I think there's also a need for us to improve our production. And I think if you listen to the stats around poultry production, they left me with a stark reality that if we don't deal with the issue around localizing some of the food systems that we are having, we run the risk of not growing the sectors that we are having. And that's very important for me as one of the things that we have got to look at. I think there's also a huge potential in terms of this sector of ensuring that we deal with the constraints that we have around, for instance, R&D, around biosecurity as we know it to be. And maybe later on as we discuss, we will get to the points around biosecurity. But it's very important that there is a very thin line between your production and trade. And in that lies the balance that we need to strike, that as you produce food that is safe and can be traded safely all across the world. And that's where we need to get to. And the last issue that I thought that will jolt us towards that red line were the issues that were discussed towards how do we deal with big data analytics at this moment, with all data that is lying almost everywhere, that really impedes our ability as a country just to construct a policy inference in terms of the data that we are having, is something that we can work on. And therefore, there is quite a lot of areas where we can work together in partnership towards ensuring that we move this into a very good trajectory where we have got growth in our sector. Thank you.
No, absolutely, TJ. And you're mentioning a lot of things about working together, possibilities, and I want to throw that to Gerard, because he's been working with all of the colleagues in the value chain in the red meat industry, which in the past we wouldn't typically see them sitting in one table. That means that there's trust that needs to be built, there's accountability that needs to be built. And now, Gerald, if you have any learnings from there that you think they might be useful to actually building up on these points and giving us that Tracy and Ferdy's dotted upward trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely, Wandile, and thank you, DG, for pointing that out. I mean, trust builds on relationships, and as Ferdy also mentioned, the constant dialogue. And we can complement the red meat primary cluster from BFAP side, taking a very bold leap in saying that, something has to change. Status quo is not acceptable. And in order to bring that change, you need a vision. And essentially that vision, the starting point being the NDP, understanding that there's clear policy, there's a clear framework that starts with the NDP. And out of that grew the master plan to say, this is a roadmap. This is where industry, private sector, and government comes together and have this dialogue, as Ferdy indicated. But out of that, that's where the real hard work started, where the industry had to come together to say, what's our own vision? And with the support from each node in the value chain, we facilitated that process of building out the strategy, being very clear, what does the industry want to achieve in the year 2030, which ties to the NDP goals. Creating that cohesion was probably the most difficult task. And that, again, is built on constant dialogue. And in that specific case, the empirical side, the side where you can't debate the facts, that was really, I think, part of the dialogue that kept everybody on that common vision. And in the end, out of that, the industry is saying that, well, we don't just want a strategy. We want something that's implementable, and that out of that grew the Red Meat Industry Services company, which in essence is tying to the slide that Ferdy showed about effective implementation, because we've had many plans, many strategies, but it's very clear from industry side and from government side that somebody needs to do the work. Somebody needs to be at grassroots level, the way that Matlo also pictured at the start of the baseline launch. And I think that's the most important bit, is the grassroots implementation. So you have a clear strategy, you have a clear vision, but you have a vehicle that is geared towards implementation. So that's where the red meat industry is currently at.
No, absolutely. And I like that point, because it talks about accountability, talks about common vision. And I want to bring that also, before I get to financing, to JFK, because Ferdy showed a nice slide of the pig industry, where we have relatively small scale, but which we haven't measured quite well, and there are possibilities for growth. And then we have another part of the pork industry, which is already commercial and is doing relatively well. Now, the question to you, JFK, is about how do we tie all of those value chain at some point together? What are some of the key building blocks that you think are useful for building up that pork production and even commercializing those that aspire to do so?
I don't think it's an easy way in dealing with it, and maybe in focusing into it is I don't think we understand this informal world to a certain extent. What we've learned out of the concept that we've dealt with in understanding that world a bit better through what BFAP did for us was, it was to a certain extent an eye-opener, because we never knew this. We assumed a few things, but we could never lay our hands on data, the bigger data, to feed us into a system that say, listen, how do you then finance an industry like that? So my first point would be, I think, dialogue in the sense of understanding where you want to go to, and also understanding what the current situation is. I think the dualistic kind of concept that we deal with in South Africa, specifically the financing side thereof, the commercial side is well known, but the informal side is not that well known. And one of the reasons why the formal financing is not moving into that informal side is because we can call it trust, it's about risk. And you can't mitigate risk because of the unknown and of the uncertainty that you deal with in this informal side. That doesn't mean there's no potential. And that's the misleading factor. The fact that it's a bit of an unknown, and the concept what they deal with is different than what you do in the formal sector, doesn't mean it's not financeable. But because we can't mitigate our risk, And we can't, to a certain extent, take this risk and convert it into a program where you say, but I will be able to withstand say, a risky situation like what we are in now. Then you won't participate in that. So I would say what we've learned out of the concept of BFAP in venturing into the informal sector for us is this wow factor that we didn't know. And immediately it opened up a mindset concept. We can change our mindset, and strategically we could apply to what needed to be applied in that specific area.
Absolutely, JFK. And I think to all of the colleagues really that are on the line here, the core of what JFK is getting to is also ties up to the importance of what BFAP is doing on saying how do we go to communities, extract data that make us understand the environment. Then the likes of DG and the other financiers thereafter can have some solid information to make a decision on. And I think this study brings us to you. Freddie made a lot of mention during the presentation that we need finance, not only finance, developmental finance. You are currently chairing the Land Bank. You've had your difficulties as what we read in the media. But I want to come to you about how are you thinking about the developmental space, and how is the Land Bank as it rebuilds, pretty much thinking about the model of funding, particularly that new cohort of farmers that could give us long-term growth?
Yeah, thanks, Wandile. And before I get to that, perhaps let me congratulate the BFAP team for another successful baseline launch. I think this, what Professor Meyer was taking us through is really a call to action around how it is that we can change the trajectory that we're seeing currently and really take it up to that red line. And I agree that finance is very, very important, and the crafting of appropriate financial solutions is something that we need to focus on. I also agree that that developmental cohort is what is going to take us to the next level. And when you speak to developing farmers, the one thing that they will always lament is lack of access to finance. The lack of finance is one of the biggest issues that emerging farmers and developing farmers talk about year in, year out. And as financiers, we've sat in sessions and we've listened to these farmers and said, absolutely, we hear you, but we really haven't put our money where our mouths are, right? We still don't see funding flowing to that cohort of farmers. And the question we need to ask ourselves is why and who needs to do it, right? So as the Land Bank, I think it is no secret that for the past few years, we have largely been playing in the commercial space. Despite the fact that we are a development financier, we ourselves have not been participating in the way that we need to in the development finance space. And now, in looking at where we are as the bank, we're saying we want to change that. We want to take the risks that commercial financiers aren't necessarily willing or able to take in the developmental space. We've really started to look at our funding model, started to get ourselves a lot closer to where agricultural policy is going. We've had a lot of engagements with Ntate Ramasodi and his department, with them really cracking the whip and really aligning us and giving us the directive to really say, this is where the agriculture and agro-processing master plan is going. This is where the Land Bank needs to feed in as a state financier, and you need to align to that. And that is something that really requires us to rethink our entire finance model and our entire positioning in the market. And that is what we'll really be seeing from us in the coming months, because that is a space that only a Land Bank can play in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tabi. Those are important points. And I want to tie them up with the DG. Is he cracking the whip, or is he also giving you the money?
It's a bit of both.
It's a bit of both. DG, talk to us about all of the blended finance, because if the Land Bank is coming there, is looking at that development, you have all of our colleagues, for example, our sponsors today, APSA, and the other commercial institutions that are also thinking about blended finance instrument in general. Going forward, how are you thinking and picturing that, particularly channeled towards this cohort of farmers that have the possibility to grow us while not ignoring the commercial constraint?
I think Wakankosi has put it very good in terms of where we are going as government. You would recall that Minister had relaunched the blended finance in March of 2020 to just rephrase and retrace where we need to go. I think the Land Bank as a product of statute has got a role to play, the developmental role to play, and the current board, in terms of where they are going, they are taking the right direction. to also redirect how the land bank works. But in terms of blended finance, you will recall that we launched the Agri-Industrial Fund in partnership with the IDC as part of this blended finance, where we're currently sitting with a 1 billion rand funding that is available for agriculture. We are expanding the very same program with the banks, and the discussions are taking a little bit longer, I know, from our side. But part of it is just ensuring that we have got a very good quantum to start. We don't start very low, but we are able to then ensure that we balance and ensure that this sector is adequately funded for us to maintain or even succeed in terms of the various areas where we are growing. I think we are slowly but surely moving away from a grant funding exercise that government was at. We're looking also at soft financing that we can get our farmers into so that we can be able then to use money sparingly wherever we can as government, because part of the challenges that we are experiencing is that we never seem to be having a graduation program into the next level where we can have our farmers being commercial. And once we get to that particular level, we can be able then to blend and be able to take the 800 and so thousand pigs that are already in the hands of black people and make them commercial. I think that's something that I learned from today and would like to challenge maybe the pig industry. How do we then move that ahead? Because it's almost a third of the pigs that we have in the country, and therefore huge potential that we have. And I think blended financing and ensuring that we understand the needs of those who want finance from us will be a great thing, because most of the time what we do, as Tadia has already said, we seem to think what the farmers need would be a grant, while the farmer is only needing a push and a soft loan to be able to progress. Thank you.
No, DG, I would fully agree with that point. I've heard people irritated with me saying we cannot be emerging forever. Mr. de Villiers knows some of those in Grain SA when they were doing amazing work in the grain space. People saying we want to progress to get to the next stage. Gerard, there was a lot of infrastructure issues that Ferdy talked about. He said infrastructure is concentrated in the northern parts of the country. When you think about it, broadly the livestock and to an extent also even in a horticulture space, what conversation are you hearing about the infrastructure targeted? And maybe you can even speak to the industry that you have done recently some good work on.
Yeah, I think, again, a key component, we mentioned a couple of times that there's great opportunity, but there are these constraining factors, and one of them being infrastructure. So, for instance, the discussion on the concession lines with rail, for instance, how do you get action going from Transnet and industry, the big co-ops, investing in those concessions, managing it. And I think for a long time, public-private partnerships have been a discussion point, but I think it's becoming clearer that it's moving beyond the discussion point and going into action. And I think at some point, industry will be at the lead of that discussion, bringing, again, the structure required, the cohesion required, and on the other side, government being the enabling partner will have to sign off certain things and say that, we'll actually have to hand over some of the control of this line or of this state parastatal in order to get action. And I think the biggest part of the discussion today in the baseline was, in order to bend that curve, there's going to have to be a give and take, a constant give and take. And that is something we've seen in the livestock industry, being quite evident, that at certain points, whether it's the veterinary department or whether it's the public health department saying that, there are certain things that we, from a logistical point of view, can't manage. It's beyond our control. We actually need full support from industry, and that's starting to happen. So I think in the export side of the industry, that's a real concern. We've done some great work with the ports authorities, Candace and her team. And again, it's in partnership with government. It's not in isolation. So government being fully aware of the constraints, but also going back to industry, to the wine industry, to the table grape industry, to the citrus industry, and saying, at what point in time of the year is your biggest constraint, the biggest bottleneck, and how can we collectively manage that? Something that in the past was a very difficult conversation, but now it's opening up. So, and I think that's part of bending that curve, right? So working collectively and doing it.
No, absolutely. I heard, as Freddie was making the point, that our agricultural sector is looking almost like a developed world. We have all of these volumes of exports that need to go up. I'm monitoring even comments online here, and just before I move to Tabi, Datera Masodi, there are people here which are saying, I think it's our friends at Stellenbosch University, that blended finance should be at the Land Bank, not at the IDC. Those are notes for you. Absolutely, absolutely. Jim.
So we spoke about the BFAP survey that they did for us on the informal sector.
Yes.
900,000 PECs. If you talk to them and you talk infrastructure, it's a total different talk than what Gerard just said.
Yes.
So infrastructure to them is, let's go to the outbreak we had in Umfuleni. Infrastructure was waste management. Just a place to, if you have a mortality, where do I dispose? So that's what we need to go back to. If we talk infrastructure, we need to make sure that we have a very wide talk on all the industries, on different levels of what is needed in infrastructure.
You're raising an important point there, JFK, because I think we should guard against the point where we will think of infrastructure only as that which facilitates logistics. In areas where I come from, for example, in the Eastern Cape, the dipping system no longer works. Those are some of the things that we need to be looking at. But Tabi, you talk about you're ready to get into development. He might give you more money. But what areas of agriculture are you really going to be focusing on in terms of the subsectors? Are you really going to be shifting the focus and looking to those that are high value, or are you as a bank just looking broadly? Just talk us through that process and your thinking.
Yeah, so Wandile, we are still focusing broadly. There are no sectors that the Land Bank is going to, to stop funding. But what we do want is really to reposition our portfolio for impact. So we are quite deliberately looking to source transactions that are aligned with the master plan and looking for transactions that are aligned to high value, high labor intensive subsectors, because we think that those are really the areas where we can make the greatest difference. But also, these are the areas where we've seen the least transformation and participation of emerging farmers. If you look, for instance, in the permanent crop sectors where it is where you have high capital intensity, high establishment costs, high lead times to any kind of cash flow, that is where we've seen the sector lagging behind from a transformation and development point of view, and that's where we want to play. So we certainly are going to continue to play broadly, but we really, really do want to focus and really have a bias towards high impact so that we can really, I think, make our rands go a lot further and really align and bring impetus to the objectives of the master plan.
No, absolutely. I think that gives us to that Prof. Mohamed Karan's point where he was talking about the jobs, horticulture and all of that space, and what Freddie was showing about the required capital to get into that space. But I also was asking that point intentionally to you because I was reading on the Lambo Weerplat some of the other professors, I think it's from Free State, saying Land Bank is funding only developing farmers. But when one looks at the data, I think the Land Bank is having 10% or so in developing farmers. So I'm looking at the camera so that that point, even our viewers online, can have appreciation of. Let me move to you, JFK, because I'm also receiving some questions online here. People are asking, do you think there is a greater appreciation about how livestock, the role the livestock sector plays on food security? That's the question we are receiving online.
Yeah, so when we had ASF outbreaks, I think the wow call for us was also, firstly, where they market their pigs. So it's totally informal. A lot of it does not go through the formal abattoirs. It's slaughtered on premises and it's sold. So the first thing that we kind of bumped into when we had outbreaks and we started slaughtering out, and there was a program with government where we assisted, was the major role they play in local communities, specifically peripheral areas around bigger townships, in the food safety, food security, and how much meat goes into that little sector. So I don't think we understand the impact of the informal. I don't think there's no GDP on what the informal does in South Africa. Yeah. So to a certain extent that's neglected, and for many reasons. I don't think it's maliciously neglected, but it's so difficult to gather that. And what we've seen practically when we move into a space where you have a little rural community, immediately you discover the impact of that food system, that production system, on that rural community. The complexity for me in the food system is not just the food. The moment you take the pigs out of it, you've spoken into a complexity that we've never seen before. So you can feed good biological waste to pigs. So if you have a factory with a byproduct, that byproduct can go into a piggery. If you take it out, immediately there's a complexity that you need to kind of manage. And what we've seen in the informal sector, that complexity is to a certain extent unknown to us. Yeah. And the magnitude of that complexity is unknown. So if you pick one little thread out, all of a sudden there's movement on other places where you've never seen it before. Yeah. So the impact in my mind is to a certain extent uncalculated.
Yeah. No, JFK, I like the points that you are making. And I want to make this because we have also our colleagues from government, Dr. Boyketo are here, and the DG next to me. Because in South African government, we hear a lot about this thing of township economy. So some of us who are coming from villages, we wonder, have you forgotten us? You talk a lot about township economies. So the understanding of what happens in the rural economy, and that's the role where I think BFAP can play an important role there. And I think even our statistic agency, I mean, I sit at the board of Stats and say, we don't have deeper understanding of that point. And I think those are areas we should be funding a lot. But DG, I won't let you go here because some of your bosses, the president, have been talking about land reform agency and all of those things. And I think when we think about that cohort of the farmers that Tabi can fund, Gerard is talking about, JFK is talking about, some of the issue around about land. What are you thinking? What is this agency? How is it going to help us? Is it another SOE? What is it?
No, thank you very much. Before I go there, your friends from Stellenbosch would think that I'm avoiding their question. When we had an arrangement with the IDC, I have got to declare so that the chair departs from this engagement, knowing that at that stage, the land bank was in ICU. Yes. And there had to be a way that we had to deal with the issues, and therefore the space is open for an engagement with the chair. On the issue around land reform, I think there are a few critical aspects that we are looking at on the value chain of land reform per se. It's how do we define and use the land that we find ourselves being restituted to communities.
Yes.
In the presentations that we have had now, there was an indication that there is a lot of land that is lying in communal areas that is currently lying fallow and can be utilized towards achieving this objective. So that's number one. The second one is around with our rapid redistribution of land and how we then identify these farmers who are already farming in different areas. And I like it in the urban areas you have got commonages. How do you decongest the commonages and ensure that they have got areas where they can farm or pieces of land where they can farm and move into small holdings where they can do farming or even into commercial areas of our time. And part of the discussions that we are having, especially on the urban edges or even in the farming communities, you have got your farm laborers, you have got people who have got tenure rights in terms of farms and have got a small piece of land where they are practicing agriculture. Those are the areas of potential growth that we need to be identifying. So to answer your question in a long way, I think there is a lot of potential in terms of land reform. There are issues that would be raised around how do we ensure that that happens. There is also a lot of goodwill that comes from the commercial sector in terms of the land donations policy, where we are also exploring of how do we then decongest and also settle our farmers into areas where they can successfully do some farming.
No, DG, you hit the nail on a head onto that, because I think all of those, there is even a vehicle, if I understand the regulations well, it could be a land bank or wherever, where there could be a land reform fund where interesting things can be done in the organization. JFK, you were part of the master plan stuff, and one of the core things now is about the implementation route. And I'm seeing the questions that are coming up in the chat here. People are worried a lot about, we have the framework about how things can work, but how do we usher and ensure that everyone buys in and takes their responsibility in implementation, in an implementation part? And perhaps after JFK, you can even anchor that route, Gerard, having done work that is looking at 2030. JFK.
So I think one concept that we set to ourselves when we did the AMP plan, or we were part of it, is we need to define roles and responsibilities. And I think as an industry, the first thing we said is we're taking up a responsibility in South Africa to play part in specifically the AMP plan. The implementation thereof in our world is not an expectation to Mr. Ramasodi. It's us as pig farmers. We need to implement the new phase that we see and where we're going to go to. So my take on the AMP plan is, I think it's a brilliant concept that shows us the potential in South Africa. There's some good vehicles inside that to be able to do it, but it starts with us. And everybody needs to take up responsibility. I think we had a question at ACBIS at their conference, and the lady asked us a question on, now who should start with this? Should we not implement and appoint people to start it? And I said to her, ma'am, you know what, I have a board of directors. We did start it. And my take is just the impact of what is going to happen here is for us as industries, but it's not just us as industries.
Yes.
And that's what the plan is showing us. It's complex, and the complexity needs to be managed. But it starts with what is my responsibility, and then we take up the responsibility of being implementer of that specific plan. I think one thing that we did say with the plan, which is vital to say again, is it's a function of an economy.
Yes.
And we need to enable an environment where we create this economy, where people want to participate, where people do participate, and then you don't need to drive people. Then people venture into the opportunity that you create into that. So it's an enablement to a certain extent for people to participate and say, I take up the responsibility that I see, that I have as an agricultural player in South Africa.
No, JFK, you're making important points there. And I'm again looking in the camera because we read the news, some of us who are also moonlighting as journalists. And there were people who were saying, the master plan is a disaster, is not useful. But I still think that it moves us a step forward. It's better than not having anything to move us forward. And I think your point, JFK, hits onto that.
Wandile, we can make it a disaster. It's our choice.
Yes.
Or we can make it a success.
Yes.
And that's your question.
And we should choose the latter.
We should, that's it. So, and by choice, we said as industries, as the red meat industry, we said, by choice, we're going to make this thing work.
Yes.
That's not, and why? Because we have the willpower to say where we're going to be in 5 years from now. Yes. So if we look at the plan, I can shoot holes into it.
Yes.
But then also when I look at the plan, I can say I can make this work.
Yes.
As an industry, as greater industries in where we play, we took a decision by saying we part and parcel of creating something more sustainable for South Africa in our space.
Thanks for that, JFK. And I think we were talking, in fact, offline with Mr. Yanni de Villiers about the next phase of implementation. And some of our colleagues, like Dr. John Purchase and others, are online. So that's an important step to that we will all be thinking about, DG, with your leadership there. Gerard, to your point, the story of trade came up a lot. Freddie emphasized the fruit space. But in the beef industry, livestock industry, there's a lot that is happening there. We've seen last year, for example, I think record exports of beef, just around about 60,000 tons that went out. Talk to us about the strategy when you're thinking about trade and what you were observing in conversation with the industry.
I mean, a key component tying to the master plan is trade. So essentially, if you reach a certain threshold, your industry needs to restructure and refocus, right? So in the red meat industry, part of the narrative and the vision coming from the master plan is growing exports, for instance, from 5% of production to 20% of production. I mean, to put that into practical terms, it would require the abattoir industry to slaughter per month at the same intensity as what they slaughter typically through December and January. So you can imagine what the implication is of growing at such a pace. But that's the opportunity, right? So there's great opportunity, and without that, we see stagnation in the market. So Tracy and myself had the conversation this morning. You know, at what, again, this threshold level in the local market, we have a lot of pressure on the consumer side, disposable income. We have affordability issue, as Ferdy also mentioned, which means that we need to get rid of the excess. And a key component of that is the public health side as well. In other words, it's not just getting rid of everything. We need to consider what's the implications throughout the entire value chain. I think also just to tie into the risk comment that Johan mentioned, and even on Tabi's side with the land bank, the whole concept about, you know, how do you measure things that you can't, or how can you manage things that you don't measure? I think that with regards to the transformation and inclusive growth, that's really one component where that slide that Ferdy showed about the progression, about measuring this, you know, in the end, if we're not constantly tracking it, the economy is changing on a weekly, monthly, daily basis, which means that we have a strategy, we have a plan, but that's a live document. It's something that needs, again, constant dialogue. It needs to engage with government. It needs to engage with the industry. Because, for instance, we're currently not trading. We're not exporting. You know, what's the implications back into the local economy? What's the implication back to at least 40% of the local herd, which is more than 1.2 million households that are fully dependent on livestock trade? Yeah. And I know it's a huge decision that the DG and his team took, but that's in parallel with a bigger strategy. So in other words, what Ferdy also mentioned, we have tactical responses amidst, you know, these bigger challenges. And the one response is a tactical one. We need to manage FMD right now for the next 3 to 4 weeks. And after that, we have to refocus and put our strategy back in place and keep our eye on the ball. And I think that's the benefit of, again, constant dialogue and the big change that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I mean, Gerard, I kept coming back to you about the red meat industry, and that was intentional in a sense that if you look into across South Africa, with all of this dualism point, and it's an important point to engage because it's a political economy of agriculture. The livestock is having a larger share of cattle that are sitting with black farmers, somewhere around about 34% or so. So the question should be to say, how do you work with those people so that they begin to commercialize and go forward? And that is important in a discussion like today. We have, for example, people like the NAMC, its chief economist, Dr. Sfiso Ntombela, is with us here in the house. He was very instrumental in setting up the master plan, DG, along with BFAP and our colleagues at CRED, which are online. And I think these institutions are some of the people we should have conversation with about measuring and evaluating continuously this master plan, so that they don't give us a plan and they go away. You have to come and measure it, Ferdy, or do that. Tabi, I want to come to you, and I'm sorry I have to do this towards the closing, but I think it's an important point to raise with you. Because if you're reading on a newspaper, you're coming here on a stage, you are talking about your prospects and how you want to work with the farmers, which is what we all appreciate. But we read on newspapers, some people saying, you are fighting with farmers as a bank, you are liquidating farmers, all of these things. But I think now we have colleagues online. If you could clarify some of those things for us as the industry.
Yeah, thank you, Wandile. I think let me start by saying that the DG is quite correct, that a few months ago, the land bank was an ICU. And efforts to revive the entity really started in earnest, I'd say about 8 months ago. And when we started as a board, I think the Minister of Finance was very clear with us that we needed to do what it takes to stabilize and revive the entity. And I think in the stabilization and revival entity, we as players in this sector must realize that there are some very difficult discussions that we need to have, and there are some very, very difficult actions that need to be taken. The Land Bank is not an entity that belongs to the National Treasury or to myself as the board or to the DG. It belongs to the sector. It is a vehicle that is created to serve the sector, and it is this sector that needs to make the decisions around what it will take to revive this. Understanding that this is an entity that borrows money from financiers, from commercial players, and lends it out to farmers with the understanding that it needs to be paid back for the bank so that the bank can meet its commitments. Now, when we start to then have discussions around the fact that, we create uncertainty around the ability of the bank to get the money back that is owed to it so that it can pay its lenders, it really has some really worrying implications around the financial sustainability of the entity itself. And my worry with this, Wandile, is that it not only affects the Land Bank. These type of sentiments really have implications across financing in the sector as a whole, right? Because where financiers, particularly in the commercial space, cannot trust that collateral means something in the sector, what does that say about financing to farmers? When financiers feel that they cannot trust the word of commercial farmers when it comes to meeting financial obligations, what does that say? So I think that we really need to understand what is expected of us, the responsibility that we have as commercial players, as development players, around meeting obligations. And I do understand that there is unhappiness, and where challenges have been communicated to us, we have dealt with those. Unfortunately, in the most recent spate of communication, the media, we have learnt about it like everyone else in the media. And where that communication comes to us, as people who were put in the Land Bank to sweep, to clean house, we have addressed it. Those have not been addressed directly with us. And so there's a number of concerning things here, but we remain open to engage. We certainly do not want to be fighting farmers. We are created for farmers. We are created to serve the interests of farmers, for all farmers, not just development farmers, but commercial players as well. But we all have to play our part to fix the Land Bank.
Thanks so much, Tabi, for those points, because I felt that it's important to outline that. Because one of the things that I was having in mind was exactly the sentiment across agriculture that somehow we are militant people that do not want to honor obligations and all of those. So that was and of course, having chatted with some of the people that the institution have engaged and they've seen joy afterwards. So I felt that those things are important. DG, as we head towards closing, everybody is talking about exports. And the comment was made, and I like that John Roach is here. He's with the DTIC, sitting at the back in the room. At AGBIS Congress, there were questions about export markets. Somebody from the DTIC said that there was nothing they could do. So we see, for example, in the numbers that were shown by Tracy, she says overall in the fruit space, we could see growth of about, I think, 38% or so going into 2030 of the volume that could come out of production. Tabi is talking about funding new people. Gerald and JFK are seeing growth where it could come, but this has to go somewhere. We are already exporting half of what we produce in value terms. So how are you engaging and changing that graph not to be red, to start to have green patches?
Thank you very much, and I'm happy that the DTIC are here. And let me start off with a point that I've seen as a competitive, even not even a competitive, a comparative advantage that I've seen, where you have got trading, almost competitors, not trading partners, who have got preferential trade agreements with certain countries. I think that's somewhere where we need to be very aggressive around, because it gives us a few advantages, especially around negotiation on the tariffs. The second aspect that I think we can also go aggressive on, it's how we access markets. It has been quite interesting to note two statistics, that we currently utilize the market access group in the fruit industry to access markets. But what I've seen today is that in actual fact, when it comes to the prioritization tool, it needs to be constantly be monitored and be adjusted to what we need. When you see blueberries growing by 160% and you see avocados by 88%, it means that you have got to get and offset that with some exports that have got to be looked at. That's number two. Number three, I think it's an issue that is really a passion that I would like to push. To say within the ambit of the WTO that we have, and within the boxes that we have, and what we still have almost around 1 billion, how do we support our sectors to ensure that they grow? Because your aggregate support to agriculture, when you look at South Africa, it's more slanted to, at this moment, because there are no tough reporting issues, more slanted towards development, agriculture. But we still have got the commercial side that would need to be equally supported, especially when it comes to that. So I think that's number three that we have got to look at. In the negotiating phase, as a country at the WTO, together with the DTIC, on how do we deal with the issues. And the last issue, of course, that is leading to a lot of commotion in the country is the issue around biosecurity.
Yes.
And we need to depart maybe from the platform with a clear understanding that if we don't deal with biosecurity issues, we are going to be the least in terms of accessing of markets. And therefore, we need to be very creative in terms of finding solutions of how do we deal with the issues that we have in our country. We are endowed with very good resources, giving us comparative and at some stage competitive advantages over other countries. How we harness this into into an advantage for all of us is very important. And I'll use the two industries, your beef industry and also the citrus industry. Mm-hmm. If you look at the beef industry and you looked at the presentation that was done, Tracy made an issue around 2016, I think 2016, 2017, 18, where there was just a surge in terms of export. Yes. Part of that was South Africa regaining our FMD-free status during that particular period. And we shouldn't discount that and the importance that that plays in terms of us. The second issue is how the citrus industry has grown to date and what we are seeing and the challenges that are there. But each and every time that we have got these challenges, there's in Afrikaans what we call toenadering, to come up with solutions. And these are the solutions that I would extend to the livestock industry and any other industry, so as for us to access these markets. Thank you very much.
No, thanks, DG. And I'm not going to let you put down the mic because Theo will tell you, for example, at AgBiz, some of our colleagues that come to us around the wool industry, which is feeling a bit of a strain. In China, 70% of our exports go there. And in your speech, you teased a little bit to us. You said you were talking with Chinese. You cannot keep those news to yourself.
Yes. The essence in terms of the discussion is the Chinese in terms of getting what is happening there through our attaché, who's based there, Mr. Malatelo Mamadi. And it takes time in terms of moving these wheels, and maybe that's something that we also have got to appreciate, that turning the wheels around SPS issues, it's a job on itself. It takes a lot of diplomacy, it takes a lot of scientific input, and the DDG responsible for agricultural production, Tate Sarahe, is here today. He will tell you that he has been each and every time sweating it out just to get this to move in a particular direction. And coming to China, we have got to admit that when we had the first outbreaks, I think just around mid 2010s or so, yes. We had a system that we put in place that would ensure that we future-proof the exports. Yes. Unfortunately, at this moment, that future-proofed system seemed to be questioned by the Chinese. And we are trying to get to a point where we make them understand that this system that we put in place were not for peace times, but for war times. And the war is now, and we think that we are compliant. I think that's the message that I need to get out to the wool industry and the work that we are doing. And in my engagements with the wool industry, we had an engagement where they had even taken time and space and money just to have a video documenting the detailed way in which this system works, and that video was also submitted to the Chinese, and we hope that we will crack it, and with time we will also crack it, because we know that the wool industry is about to have its season opening up, and there's a lot of anticipation, there's a lot of ways of saying when is this happening, and we hope that we'll be able to crack it. Thank you very much.
No, thanks, DG, and 100% correct on that. Because one would hope that China will be more open to our wool. They have their difficulties with Australia, who is our competitor. So I think we are rather sitting on a better space of geopolitics. Anyway, and DG, I was asking the issues of trade intentionally. And looking at DDG Serage, who's been working very hard throughout the session, because and again looking into the camera, because the anticipation or the message that we typically make as private sector is to say you are not doing anything to trade, and I must say that though academically that is perhaps maybe a misjudgment, because if one looks at the data of the evolution of South Africa's agricultural exports, Sfiso Ndombela and Tinashe Kapuya have done useful work there. You see where we are. Even last year, on numbers shown by Tracy, we are somewhere $12.4 billion or so in record terms. So we do appreciate the work that with DG Serage and all of you are doing in the department on that. But it's about now, how do we take that work forward? Colleagues, I see that we are closer to closing the time, and people there at the back are lifting hands for me. But let me close off by asking each of you one question as we go forward, and I'll start with you, Gerard. About should we be? Are you excited about the future? Do you believe the strategy you wrote for Dewald and the guys going forward?
Well, it's only you and me with our notebooks here, and the comment was I'm outdated. But I think with regards to the strategy is, I think for the first time in many years, the industry have a common vision and there's cohesion, and it's tying to the master plan, and there's a constant engagement with government, and government is also supporting that process. So absolutely, and I think from BFAP's side, our role to play, as Johan indicated, what's the roles and responsibilities, and that's key. I think who takes the lead with regards to the enabling environment, who takes the lead with regards to advocacy and policy, and in the end, implementation and monitoring and making sure we're measuring the impact, of which the latter is where we support. And I think as Ferdy also indicated throughout the entire BFAP team is constantly driving that.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that message, Gerard. Tabi, you saw the growth, you saw the prospects. Are you excited as a bank? Are you getting into with the drive of driving that red line of growth?
We're very excited. We think that there's a lot of scope for growth, and we're really excited to take farmers along with us. For us, as a development player, we want to see all farmers on the land. It is never a good thing to see a farmer off the land. So in even building the new segment that we're looking at, we want to take all the farmers with us. We want to support the existing farmers that we have. We want to bring in the new cohort of farmers. We think it's important, not just from a financial perspective, but for policy stability. We need to get equality. We need to get transformation in the sector. It is really the only way that we get the kind of policy certainty that we need. So we are really looking forward to this journey, and we really do appreciate the input that we've received, because it is the sector that builds this entity. And so this is a very, very exciting journey for us. And I think, Ferdy, certainly, if we all make an effort, that red line is exactly where we're going to be, and we're really taking that as a challenge. So thank you to the BFAP team for that.
No, thanks, Tabi. I'll make a comment, Ferdy. You should have made that line green. Things that are red. Yes, no. Absolutely on that, Freddie. And JFK prospects?
He battled when he did the red meat industries concept, and I took him for breakfast. We had bacon, and they were off again. So I want to particularly three things. So it's a pig industry. I don't think there's an industry with more difficulty than the pig industry. If you have a look on the profitability, I think it's the lowest ever. We're battling. Three things. If we focus too much on the history, as what we entitled to do to a certain extent.
Yeah.
We miss the future.
Yes.
But we need to learn from the history.
Yes.
Currently, if I need to look into our industry currently, I need to run because it's so difficult. My take out of today is I want to see the future. And how do we embrace the future? And I think we have too little dialogue about how should the future look like. How should this future for the small-scale guy in Umfuleni look like?
Yeah.
And talk about that. And they then start creating amongst people this sense of urgency to reach this future. So my end with this is, it's a stunning day. And what I see out of this day, if I look into the current situation, it's difficult. But if I see where we can go and where we will go, then I say, listen, let's think future and then say, what can we apply to reach that future?
No, absolutely, JFK. And let me correct myself to colleagues joining us online. You've heard Freddie says, we're talking about the line going up, not the red going down. And I like the points that JFK is making, because there's always a thinking in a South African sense, for example, that when you talk about transformation, it is a zero-sum game, that you are taking from a white farmer, black farmer, all of that. But what we've learned from the work that the BFAP has put out is that there are underutilized places of land. We're really talking about growing the pie, but leaning on the efforts of everyone in that in that effort. So it's not really about a zero-sum game. It's actually a progress for the country. DG, we will close with you. You have all of the stakeholders in the room. You have some joining us online. What are you hoping for, and what would you like them to do to help us and yourself as a department leading that charge of South Africa Inc.?
One day there is a saying that if your dreams are not big enough to scare you, then you haven't dreamt at all. And I think the master plan has given us an opportunity to dream and dream big. And the weight in terms of expectations has shifted to a point where we need to deliver. And at this point, we need all hands on deck to deliver and ensure that united we stand in terms of yielding a prosperous and sustainable agricultural sector. And we can only do that if we hold hands and ensure that the vision that we have always had, starting from 1994 with the broadening of access to agricultural thrust, up to today with the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan, we are able to sustain that. And to all sector stakeholders, I think it has been a very good session that we have had today. And thanks to BFAP for the excellent presentations.
No, thank you so much, DG. Let me close off by saying to all the colleagues online, the booklet, you can download it at BFAP website, www.bfap.co.za. And as an organization, we are also on Twitter, at BFAP6, you will see, tweet the link, put the agricultural information out there to other people that are not in this sector. And let me thank you all for being with us from BFAP side. And we appreciate all of these insights. I know there weren't questions from the floor, but we are all here for tea and coffee just after this. Thank you.